My name is Marcus Shaw. I am 41 years old, and for most of my adult life I wore a uniform instead of a suit. I spent 15 years in the United States Army, rising to the rank of captain, working in logistics strategy across the Middle East and parts of Africa. My job was never about glory. It was about moving people, supplies, and decisions through chaos, and doing it without excuses. When I left the military, it was not because I failed. It was because I believed those skills could survive outside the wire. The morning of that interview, I told myself it was just another room, another assessment. I had walked into briefing tents under mortar fire. A glass office tower in the city should not have shaken me. Still, as the elevator climbed, I felt something familiar in my chest. Not fear, suspicion. The kind you get when you know you are stepping into a place that has already decided who you are. I adjusted my jacket, one I had bought 2 weeks earlier because I knew my service record would not dress itself. The receptionist barely looked up when I gave my name. She glanced at her screen, then at me, like she was matching a face to a category she did not expect. That was the first signal. The second came when I entered the conference room. Polished table, soft lighting, people who looked comfortable before the conversation even started. They did not ask about decisions under pressure. They did not ask about leading teams through uncertainty. Their eyes stayed on the paper in front of them. Military background, logistics, captain. The words sat there like a translation problem. I could feel the judgment forming, quiet but confident. This guy follows orders. This guy does not belong here. I sat down anyway. I folded my hands the way I had learned years ago, steady and neutral. Inside, I was doing the same thing I always did before an operation. Taking inventory, reading the room, understanding the terrain. I realized then that this was not an interview yet. This was a test I had not agreed to take. They were not trying to learn who I was. They were deciding how much I needed them. That was when the old instinct kicked in. The one the Army never took from me. If they were going to measure me by a resume, I would let them. But I was already planning my next move, because I knew one thing for certain. I had survived worse rooms than this. Joanna didn't shake my hand. She didn't smile. She barely looked up from her tablet as she called my name and motioned for me to take a seat. I had seen that look before, the one people wear when they believe they already know everything worth knowing. She scanned the top of my resume like it was a resume from a completely different world. To her, it probably was. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs, tapping the end of her pen on the table like she was trying to keep herself awake. "You were in logistics, right?" she asked. "Military logistics." I nodded once. 15 years. Global operations. She tilted her head like she was hearing an answer she hadn't expected but didn't care enough to explore. Her next question came fast, too fast to be curious. "And how do you think that qualifies you for corporate strategy?" I could feel it then, that slow burn in my chest. Not rage, not even frustration, it was something colder. The kind of pain that comes when someone cuts deep without even knowing they're holding a knife. I didn't blink. I had learned a long time ago that silence, used right, can be louder than any defense. I reached into my folder and slid one page across the table. It was a logistics strategy I had built the night before, tailored for their Southeast distribution problem, a real issue I had uncovered while researching their annual report. Joanna didn't touch the paper. Her eyes hovered over it for a second before she asked, "You found that on our website?" I nodded. "The problem is buried in your fourth quarter earnings call. You mentioned delays in regional rollouts. This plan would cut those delays by 18% and reduce carrier redundancy by a third." She raised an eyebrow. "You're not even in the system and you think you can audit our operations?" I didn't smile. I didn't blink. I said what I came to say. I've built outposts in places where maps didn't exist. I've supplied forward teams in hostile zones with nothing but satellite drops and gut instinct. I've rebuilt networks in days after they were destroyed overnight. I know supply chains, and I know how to think when everything goes sideways. Her silence said more than her words. She looked back down at her tablet and made a quick note. Probably something dismissive. Probably something like, not a culture fit or too rigid. That's when it hit me. She didn't see me as capable. She saw me as inconvenient. A puzzle that didn't fit into the picture she wanted to present to her team. She leaned forward, a slight smirk on her face. We're really looking for someone who understands digital transformation at scale, she said. Someone who knows how to speak the language of tech and innovation. I leaned forward too, just enough to let her know I wasn't intimidated. Digital transformation is nothing without operational backbone. You can't scale chaos. That was the moment I realized she had stopped listening. She had already filed me away. Ex-military, probably good with discipline, maybe useful for middle management, not a strategist, not a leader, not someone who could sit at the table. She wanted a poster child, not a partner. But I didn't walk out. I stayed. Not because I needed the job, but because I needed to see what kind of world this was. Who got valued, who got dismissed, who got the benefit of the doubt, and who had to bleed to earn it. I didn't walk out, but I walked away with clarity. The kind that doesn't need validation. The kind that gets sharper in silence. We were wrapping up. Joanna had already started her polite disengagement routine. Her voice turned smooth, her eyes unreadable. I could feel her mentally walking me to the door while still seated. Then it happened. The door cracked open and a man stepped in. No knock, no hesitation. He was tall, clean-cut, late 60s. Civilian clothes, but everything about his posture screamed military. Joanna started to stand, caught off guard. Marcus Shaw, the man said. I turned. And for the first time that morning, someone in that room saw me. Fully saw me. General Dawson, I said before I could think. I hadn't seen him in almost a decade. He stepped forward with a calm smile and clapped me on the shoulder. You're the one who rerouted an entire forward supply chain through dry territory in Kandahar during that winter op. You saved 2 units from being stranded. We still talk about that. The silence in the room cracked like glass. Joanna's lips parted, but no sound came out. The general turned toward her and said, "This guy right here doesn't just think under pressure. He builds the damn map while others are still trying to find their compass." He looked back at me. "Didn't know you were in the pipeline here," I smiled slightly. "Just trying to bring what I know to a different battlefield." Joanna tried to recover, stumbling into a sentence about potential fit. But her voice lacked conviction. The power balance had shifted in an instant. The man she had quietly dismissed as too rigid, too old school, too military had just been stamped with elite recognition. Not by a resume, not by buzzwords, but by someone who had seen me operate when it mattered. The general nodded once more. "Good to see you again, Marcus. Hope they realize what they're sitting on." Then he left, just as quietly as he had entered. No theatrics, just impact. The kind that sticks. I didn't need to say anything after that. I let the silence do its work. For the first time that morning, Joanna looked unsure. And I made sure she saw it. The moment the door closed behind General Dawson, everything shifted. Joanna suddenly found her smile. Warm, polished, professional. She leaned forward, like we were old colleagues, who had just reconnected after a long absence. It was a performance, but a good one. Her voice had softened, her posture loosened. She complimented my insight, said my field experience gave me a unique lens they were missing. Then came the offer: senior strategy advisor, cross-functional oversight, direct access to top-level projects. A package that would make most people leap across the table. Salary, title, perks. On paper, it was a win. She laid it all out like a gift. The same person who couldn't be bothered to ask a real question 30 minutes earlier now wanted me as a key player. I listened carefully. I kept my expression neutral. I asked the right questions. What teams would I lead? What autonomy I'd have? What success looked like in the role? She answered quickly, maybe too quickly. Everything sounded good. Everything sounded rehearsed. But underneath it, I could feel something off. Not disrespect. Something subtler. Strategic positioning. This wasn't about seeing my worth. It was about protecting theirs. I wasn't being brought in to lead. I was being brought in to cover a blind spot, to be their proof that they could adapt, modernize, include. The offer wasn't really about me. It was about optics. Joanna didn't see value, she saw leverage. Part of me wanted to take it. I'd been job hunting for months. The rejections had stacked up like bruises. The money was good, the title better. I could make it work, I told myself. I'd carve out space. I'd prove myself all over again. But I'd done that already. In deserts and war rooms. On foreign soil and in frozen outposts. I knew what it felt like to earn respect. This wasn't it. Joanna kept smiling, waiting for my reaction. I smiled back, just enough to keep her comfortable. I told her I'd think about it, that I appreciated the opportunity, and I meant it. But I also knew something else. When people try too hard to make you feel important, it's often because they've just realized how badly they underestimated you. I walked out of that building with an offer in hand, but in my gut, I felt no victory, just a quiet warning. The cage was gold, yes, but it was still a cage, and I hadn't made it this far just to be boxed in again. I didn't leave the military because I was tired. I left because they made it clear I no longer fit the image. 15 years in uniform, 2 continents, 6 tours, and somehow that wasn't enough once the politics changed. They said they wanted new leadership, fresh energy. That was the phrase. As if experience had an expiration date, the new brass came in with shiny buzzwords and spotless boots. Most of them had never seen a forward base in blackout conditions. Never watched a convoy go silent mid-transmission. Never had to write a casualty report at 2 in the morning. But they had ideas. Rebranding, they called it. Modernizing the command structure. What it really meant was younger faces, polished resumes, and the right handshake circles. I remember sitting across from a major who used to ask me for help with briefing decks. Now, he was telling me the system needed to evolve. That I was part of the old guard. It hit hard. Not just because I was being cut out, but because I'd built everything around that uniform. Every decision, every sacrifice. I'd missed birthdays, funerals, whole seasons of my son's life. I believed in the mission, even when the headlines didn't. I believed in the people beside me. I believed loyalty counted for something. But in the end, it didn't. They offered a quiet exit. Honorable discharge, good references, no fuss. It was clean on paper, but inside it felt like a betrayal. Like being pushed out of your own home because someone decided it needed better curb appeal. I packed my bags and didn't look back. But something changed that day. I stopped trusting that systems cared about service. And I started looking for something real. Something I could build without needing permission. It was a Sunday afternoon when I met up with Ray Thompson. We hadn't talked much since he left the force, but I remembered him as the kind of guy who could keep calm under gunfire and make you laugh 5 minutes later. He texted me out of nowhere, said he'd heard I was in town and that he had a garage, 2 folding chairs, and some damn good coffee. We sat there with the door half open, letting the breeze in, and just talked. No filters, no performance. He told me how he tried corporate too. How they wanted the medals on his resume, but none of the mindset. Same old story, hired for image, ignored for substance. He said it felt like trying to teach a room full of mannequins how to move. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. It was that kind of laugh that comes from knowing someone else has been bruised the same way you have. Then he said something that stuck. What if we stop asking for a seat at their table and build our own? Not a company. A unit. Small, sharp, real. No fluff. Just people who've done the work and still believe in getting their hands dirty. I didn't answer right away. Just looked around his garage. It was half workshop, half storage, all grit. Old whiteboard in the corner. Coffee ring on the concrete floor. I could see it. Something real. Growing from nothing. I leaned back in my chair and said, yeah, maybe it's time we stop fitting into broken systems. Maybe it's time we write our own playbook. That's how it started. No business plan, no investors. Just two guys, a garage, and an idea. We didn't know if it would work, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about rejection. I was thinking about building something that didn't need anyone else's approval. We called ourselves Recon, short for Reconstructive Strategies. It wasn't flashy, and that was the point. We weren't selling smoke. We were bringing the same principles that kept soldiers alive into boardrooms that had never seen real pressure. Precision, integrity, execution under fire. We didn't need branding. We needed results. Our first call came from a mid-sized logistics firm on the brink of collapse. They just burned through 2 consultants, missed their last 3 quarters, and were about to lay off a third of their workforce. The CEO was exhausted and desperate. She said, "A friend told her we think different." She was right. We didn't hand her a glossy deck. We sat down, listened, then started mapping every broken point in her supply chain like it was a battlefield. Ray ran the field analysis. I took the resource model. We broke the problem into 3 layers. The issue wasn't just inventory lag. It was miscommunication between departments and vendor blind spots. We realigned their internal ops like a forward base, field-tested a new route planning model in under 10 days, rolled it out in 2 weeks. They recovered faster than any of their own people thought possible. No LinkedIn posts, no press releases, just a quiet win with massive impact. 2 weeks later, another CEO called, said she'd heard about us through a supplier. Then a regional tech firm reached out. They didn't care where we'd worked. They cared that we got things done. That's when we knew we'd hit something real. No fancy suits, no catered pitches, just performance. We worked fast and quiet. Mornings started with black coffee and whiteboard drills. Midday was ops reviews and team calls that felt more like mission briefs. Nights were deep work sessions, code cracking, and case simulations. We weren't building a company, we were deploying an operation. 1 client turned into 3. 3 turned into 7. All referrals, all off the radar. We were still working from Ray's garage, but that space felt more like a command center than a startup. We had no receptionist, no logo, and no overhead. But people started calling us by name. Not because of a campaign. Because someone they trusted said we made a difference. That kind of reputation you can't buy. You earn it, 1 fire at a time. We didn't chase visibility. We chased precision. Every project was a mission. Every client a partner. We didn't talk about values. We lived them. And without realizing it, we had become the kind of force most companies didn't even know they needed until the fire was already burning. That's how the unseen force began. Not loud, not pretty, but relentless. We didn't have a booth. We didn't have a logo on the conference brochure. When they asked us to speak at the National Strategy Forum, we said yes on 1 condition: no slides, no gimmicks. Just a straight story about how real work gets done when it matters most. They gave us 15 minutes between panels from 2 Fortune 500 giants. We walked in with coffee-stained notepads and wore the same jackets we wore on client calls. Ray opened with a story from one of our early deployments. I followed with a breakdown of how we reversed a failing supply chain using nothing but phone calls and field data. No jargon, no fluff, just facts and outcomes. A few people looked confused, some intrigued. Most didn't expect much, but we weren't there to impress. We were there to tell the truth. And then it happened. From the back of the room, someone stood up. I recognized the voice before I saw the face. It was Robert Lang, a former VP from Archwell, the same man who once told me my military background was a liability. He cleared his throat and looked straight at me. "That man right there," he said, "saved $1 billion project my team had almost buried. We didn't know it at the time. We just thought the system fixed itself. It didn't. He did." The room went quiet. All the noise, the shifting papers, the skeptical glances, they stopped. People leaned in, not because of who was talking, but because of what they were hearing. Real results, quiet impact, no branding needed. I nodded once. Not smug, not dramatic, just a man who had done the work and finally didn't need to explain it. Recognition is sweeter when it comes from the last person who thought you were invisible. Not long after that conference, Archwell reached out, this time not with a job offer, with a buyout. They wanted to acquire Recon, fold us into their structure, use our name to boost their own credibility. The number was high, the kind of money that makes people pause. But I didn't pause. I told them no, because what we had built couldn't be bought. It wasn't about valuation, it was about foundation. We weren't selling process, we were rebuilding trust, and that's something no old system could replicate. We didn't exist to make headlines. We existed to prove something simple. That a small, loyal team with the right principles could outperform the biggest players. Ray and I went back to work that same afternoon. No champagne, no announcement, just another mission on the board. Because once you've built something with your own hands, something born from fire and rejection and truth, you don't trade it in for comfort. You protect it, you grow it, you pass it on. So let me ask you this. Are you waiting for a seat at their table, or are you ready to build your own? Because at the end of the day, the system will always try to own you. But your vision, your integrity, your work, those are things they can't steal. Not unless you hand them over.